The rope hung over the edge of Hacksaw Ridge like a lifeline to hell, its hemp fibers already darkening with moisture from the April rain that had been falling since dawn. Corporal Jenkins watched Desmond Doss test the knots for the fourth time that morning, his weathered hands moving with the methodical precision of a man who knew that lives hung on every twist of fiber. The 77th Infantry Division had been clinging to the top of this coral escarpment for 3 days now, and the Japanese positions in the caves below showed no sign of weakening. "Doss!" Captain Muller called from the command post, a shallow depression behind a shattered tree stump that offered minimal protection from the sporadic mortar fire. "We need to talk about your status here." The medic looked up from his rope inspection, rain dripping from the rim of his helmet. Around them, the other men of the company huddled in whatever cover they could find, their faces bearing the hollow exhaustion of soldiers who had learned that Okinawa's ridges were nothing like the training manuals back in the States. The morning's assault had ended like the previous two, with wounded men scattered across the plateau's killing ground, while Japanese machine guns maintained their deadly watch from concealed positions. Sergeant Williams lay motionless near an overturned ammunition crate, and Private Coleman's agonized calls for a medic had been echoing across the ridge for the past hour. The Browning .50 caliber machine gun that had seemed so formidable during their landing on the Okinawan beaches now squatted uselessly behind its steel shield, unable to provide effective covering fire for a rescue attempt. "Sir, they're still up there," Doss replied, his voice carrying that quiet stubbornness that had earned him equal measures of respect and frustration from his fellow soldiers. His medical aid bag, conspicuously absent of any weapon, seemed almost pathetic next to the rifles and ammunition pouches of the men around him. Yet something in his steady gaze suggested a different kind of readiness, not for killing, but for the infinitely more complex task of preserving life under fire. Jenkins spat into the mud, watching the rope sway slightly in the wind that swept across the ridge. He had mocked Doss during training, called him crazy for refusing to carry a rifle into combat. Now, 3 days into the hell of Hacksaw Ridge, that mockery had curdled into something more complicated. The medic had already made 2 trips across the exposed ground yesterday, dragging wounded men to safety while enemy fire snapped overhead like angry insects. Each time, Jenkins had watched through his rifle scope, finger on the trigger, searching for targets he couldn't see, while an unarmed man accomplished what their combined firepower couldn't. The Japanese had turned the reverse slope of Hacksaw Ridge into a maze of interlocking fields of fire, with machine gun nests hidden in coral caves and mortar tubes positioned to drop shells with surgical precision on any rescue attempt. The 77th Infantry Division's advance had ground to a halt against these positions, leaving dozens of wounded Americans stranded in the open. Standard evacuation procedures had proven useless. Stretcher bearers couldn't cross the kill zone, and the steep face of the ridge made conventional medical evacuation impossible. Captain Mueller checked his watch, rainwater pooling in the crystal face. "Artillery's coming in at 1700 hours. We're pulling back to secondary positions." The words carried the weight of abandonment. Wounded men left to face the night alone while their brothers retreated to safety. Doss knelt beside his aid bag, fingers checking his meager supplies. 3 morphine syrettes, a handful of bandages, 2 tourniquets. Against the scale of suffering that lay scattered across the plateau, it seemed absurdly inadequate. "Thought you all left us," Private Coleman had whispered when Doss reached him during the first rescue attempt. The boy's eyes, wide with shock and pain, reflected a trust that cut deeper than any blade. It was a trust Doss couldn't bear to break, even when every rational instinct screamed for him to seek cover with the others. The rope over the cliff edge represented more than just an evacuation route. It was a promise, a commitment that transcended military doctrine and touched something deeper in the human spirit. Behind him, the men of his company prepared for withdrawal, cleaning weapons that would soon fall silent, packing gear for a retreat that tasted of failure in every mouth. But Doss remained by the rope, studying the knots that would bear the weight of broken bodies and shattered dreams, calculating angles and distances with the grim mathematics of battlefield medicine. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The first wounded man lay 40 yards from the rope, close enough that Doss could see the dark stain spreading across Coleman's chest, far enough that the journey would require crossing 3 separate fields of fire. Japanese voices echoed from the cave mouths along the ridge, a reminder that the enemy was very much alive and watching for any movement across the coral-strewn plateau. The 77th Infantry Division's intelligence reports had underestimated the defensive positions by a factor of 3. What should have been a swift advance had become a grinding siege. Doss moved with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that speed would only get him killed. Each step across the broken ground required a calculation of cover and concealment, using shell holes and scattered equipment as stepping stones through the kill zone. The Japanese had spent months preparing Hacksaw Ridge for defense, turning every natural depression into an overlapping sector of fire, every coral outcropping into a potential sniper's nest. Private Harrison called out from somewhere near the center of the plateau, his voice weak but carrying clearly in the humid air. "Medic, please!" The sound cut through the sporadic rifle fire like a prayer, adding another name to the growing list of men who needed evacuation before the artillery barrage began. Captain Mueller had been firm about the timeline. 1,700 hours, no exceptions. The big guns would saturate the ridge, whether American wounded remained or not. Jenkins watched through his rifle scope as Doss reached Coleman's position, the medic's movements economical and practiced despite the sniper fire that occasionally cracked overhead. The young soldier had taken shrapnel across his chest and a bullet through his shoulder, wounds that would prove fatal without immediate treatment. Yet here was their weaponless medic, working with steady hands while enemy machine guns swept the area around him like deadly searchlights. "Crazy bastard's going to get himself killed," Jenkins muttered, though his voice carried more admiration than criticism. The other soldiers shared his mixture of awe and frustration, watching their unarmed comrade accomplish what their combined firepower couldn't achieve. Each successful movement toward the wounded represented a small victory against the tactical reality that had trapped their company on this hell-swept ridge. The evacuation technique Doss had developed over the past 3 days relied on the rope and cliff face in ways no field manual had ever described. Instead of trying to carry wounded men back across the kill zone, he would drag them to the rope and lower them down the sheer face of Hacksaw Ridge to safety below. It required strength, skill, and a faith that bordered on the supernatural, faith in knots tied under fire, in rope that frayed with each load, in his own ability to control a descent while enemy mortars walked across the ridge above. Coleman's evacuation took 20 minutes of pure terror, interrupted by moments of eerie silence when even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Doss rigged a harness from torn canvas and communications wire, then began the careful process of lowering the wounded man down the cliff face while Japanese machine guns opened up across the plateau. Each burst of enemy fire forced him flat against the coral, rope burning through his palms, as Coleman's weight threatened to tear the line from his hands. The men of the 77th Infantry Division below caught Coleman as he reached the bottom, their faces reflecting the same mixture of relief and disbelief that marked every successful evacuation. Dr. Patterson, the battalion surgeon, had stopped asking how the wounded were reaching his aid station from the supposedly inaccessible ridgetop. He simply treated what arrived and sent word back up that more morphine and bandages were needed, always more than could be safely transported to the front. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Okinawa, the tactical situation remained unchanged. Japanese positions intact, American wounded scattered across the plateau, and one unarmed medic moving between them with the methodical determination of a man who refused to accept the mathematics of abandonment. The rope over Hacksaw Ridge continued its deadly work, lowering broken bodies to safety while enemy fire sought to cut the lifeline that connected hope to reality. Sergeant Williams raised his head slightly, blood trickling from a scalp wound that looked worse than it was. His eyes found Doss through the smoke and coral dust, conveying a message that needed no words. One more man ready for the rope, one more test of faith against the gathering darkness that would soon force even the most determined medic to choose between salvation and suicide. By late afternoon, word had spread through the 77th Infantry Division's rear positions that something extraordinary was happening on Hacksaw Ridge. Radio operators passed fragments of reports, wounded men appearing at aid stations when no evacuation had been ordered, a single medic operating beyond the front lines, impossible rescues from an inaccessible cliff face. Dr. Patterson found himself treating casualties faster than the official casualty reports could account for, each arrival carrying stories of an unarmed soldier who appeared through the smoke like a figure from another world. Private Martinez lay semi-conscious near a destroyed bunker, his breathing shallow but steady. Doss reached him just as Japanese mortars began walking across the ridge again, each explosion sending shockwaves through the coral substrate and fragments whistling through the humid air. The positioning required for Martinez's evacuation would expose both men to direct observation from enemy positions, turning the rescue into a mathematical problem of angles and timing that no training manual had ever addressed. Captain Muller monitored reports from other units along the Okinawan front, each message confirming the larger picture of grinding attrition that defined the Pacific War's final phase. The Japanese had prepared their defensive positions with the knowledge that every ridge, every cave, every coral formation might be their final stand. They fought with the desperation of men who understood that retreat meant only a slightly delayed death, making each yard of ground cost more blood than American planners had anticipated. The rope over Hacksaw Ridge showed increasing signs of wear, individual hemp fibers parting under the repeated stress of lowering wounded men down the cliff face. Doss inspected each strand with the focused attention of a man who knew that mechanical failure would mean not just his own death, but the abandonment of every wounded soldier still calling for help across the plateau. The knots required constant retying. The anchor points needed reinforcement, and each successful evacuation brought the rope closer to catastrophic failure. Jenkins found himself maintaining a constant watch over the cliff edge, rifle ready to provide what covering fire he could for the medic's impossible mission. His frustration had evolved into something approaching reverence as he witnessed rescue after rescue accomplished through nothing more than determination and improvised technique. The Browning .50 caliber that had seemed so formidable during training now felt inadequate against an enemy that remained invisible, while their weaponless medic achieved victory after victory through means that defied military logic. Corporal Shaw suffered from abdominal wounds that required immediate surgical attention, his condition deteriorating with each passing hour. Doss improvised a stabilizing harness that would prevent further internal damage during the cliff descent, working with materials scavenged from destroyed equipment and torn uniforms. The evacuation took 30 minutes of careful maneuvering, complicated by Shaw's semi-conscious state and the increasing accuracy of Japanese mortar fire. The wounded continued to accumulate at Dr. Patterson's aid station below the ridge, each arrival representing another small miracle in a war that had grown short on miracles. The battalion surgeon worked with supplies stretched beyond their intended capacity, performing triage decisions that would have been unthinkable during peacetime. Yet men kept arriving from above, broken but breathing, wounded but alive, carried down an impossible cliff face by an unarmed soldier who refused to accept the arithmetic of abandonment. As the sun dropped toward the horizon over Okinawa, tactical reality began to assert itself with increasing urgency. Artillery coordinates had been calculated, firing solutions prepared, shells loaded into guns that would soon saturate Hacksaw Ridge with high explosive, regardless of who remained on top. The 77th Infantry Division's withdrawal proceeded on schedule, leaving only essential personnel forward to guide the final evacuation. Private Foster's legs had been mangled by grenade fragments, requiring a complex harness system that would prevent further damage during descent. Doss worked by feel in the gathering dusk, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, despite the accumulating exhaustion of a day spent under fire. Each knot represented a small act of faith, each length of rope a promise to bring another brother home alive. The enemy maintained their disciplined fire, machine guns and mortars, responding to any movement with mechanical precision. Yet somehow the rope continued its work, lowering man after man to safety, while Japanese positions remained unable to stop what they could observe, but not fully understand. One unarmed American soldier moving across ground that should have been impassable, accomplishing evacuations that should have been impossible, sustained by something stronger than tactical doctrine or military training. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope had become something more than equipment. It was a lifeline connecting the living to the dying, hope to despair, the possible to the miraculous. As darkness gathered over Hacksaw Ridge, Doss began what would become the most legendary phase of his mission. Sergeant Williams, the squad leader who had been playing dead for 3 hours while Japanese patrols moved past his position, finally signaled for evacuation. His internal injuries required immediate surgical attention, and the journey to the cliff edge would expose both men to fire from 3 directions. The 77th Infantry Division's artillery barrage was now less than 2 hours away, its timing coordinated with similar strikes across the Okinawan front. Radio messages crackled through the humid air as battery commanders confirmed firing solutions and ammunition loads. Yet on top of Hacksaw Ridge, one unarmed medic continued his methodical work, moving through the darkness with the quiet determination of a man who had found his purpose in the most unlikely of places. Private Kelly lay trapped in a shell crater too deep for conventional evacuation, his condition deteriorating with each passing hour. The solution required Doss to rappel down into the crater using communications wire, stabilize Kelly's wounds in near-complete darkness, then somehow lift him to ground level. Engineering principles learned in civilian life merged with battlefield improvisation as Doss rigged a counterweight system using his own body weight and scattered ammunition boxes. Jenkins watched through his nightscope as the medic worked, occasionally providing covering fire when enemy movement threatened the rescue effort. His earlier mockery of Doss's beliefs had transformed into something approaching awe as he witnessed impossible rescue after impossible rescue, accomplished through nothing more than faith and determination. The weaponless medic had achieved more tactical success in 1 day than their entire company had managed in 3 days of conventional operations. The rope showed critical signs of wear, individual strands parting under the accumulated stress of a dozen evacuations. Each descent now carried the possibility of catastrophic failure. Yet Doss continued his work with the same methodical precision that had marked his first rescue attempt. Trust in equipment merged with trust in something larger, a faith that transcended military doctrine and touched the fundamental human obligation to preserve life regardless of cost. Japanese searchlights began sweeping the ridge as enemy commanders prepared their own night operations, turning the plateau into a maze of moving shadows and sudden illumination. Doss timed his movements to avoid the searching beams, using terrain features and destroyed equipment as cover while maintaining his impossible evacuation schedule. Each successful rescue brought him closer to the artillery deadline, yet also closer to completing a mission that no one had ordered him to undertake. Dr. Patterson's aid station below the ridge had evolved into a testament to one man's determination, with wounded soldiers arriving in defiance of every tactical assessment and evacuation timeline. The battalion surgeon worked through the night, treating men who should have been abandoned, saving lives that should have been lost, processing casualties that existed only because one unarmed medic refused to accept the mathematics of military necessity. The final evacuation, Kelly's extraction from the deep crater, required every technique Doss had developed over his day of impossible rescues. The counterweight system functioned exactly as improvised, lifting the wounded soldier to ground level while Japanese mortars began their final preparatory fires. When Kelly reached the crater's rim, friendly artillery rounds whistled overhead, and the rope that had carried so many to safety finally showed signs of imminent failure. Captain Muller appeared at the cliff edge as the barrage began, his face reflecting the complex emotions of a commander who had witnessed something beyond military comprehension. 24 hours earlier, he had been ready to court-martial Doss for refusing to carry a weapon. Now he watched an unarmed soldier complete the most successful combat rescue operation in the 77th Infantry Division's history, saving dozens of lives through methods that no field manual had ever described. The rope held for one final descent as Doss lowered himself down the cliff face, his mission complete and his men safe. Behind him, artillery fire illuminated Hacksaw Ridge like a deadly sunrise, erasing the killing ground where so many had waited for death and found salvation instead. The hemp fibers that had carried wounded soldiers to safety finally parted as the medic reached the bottom, their work complete and their purpose fulfilled. 23 years after Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond Doss sat in his small Virginia home, rain drumming against the windows with the same rhythm he remembered from Okinawa. His hands, weathered now and bearing the permanent tremor of old wounds, held a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs requesting his testimony for a historical project. The official account spoke of heroic rescues and miraculous evacuations, but it missed the central secret that had sustained him through that night of impossible choices. The truth was simpler and more terrifying than any citation could capture. He had been scared beyond rational thought for most of those hours on the ridge. Each time he approached the rope, his body had shaken with a fear so complete it seemed to replace his blood with ice water. The heroic medic of the official reports bore little resemblance to the young man who had whispered desperate prayers between each evacuation, begging God for strength to make one more trip across ground that should have killed him a dozen times over. Dr. Patterson, now retired and living in Ohio, had his own version of that night stored in medical records and personal memory. The wounded soldiers who arrived at his aid station carried stories of an angel or a ghost, someone who appeared through the smoke and darkness to drag them to safety when death seemed certain. Yet Patterson remembered the medic's condition when he finally descended the cliff for the last time, exhausted beyond description, hands torn and bleeding from rope burns, eyes holding a particular 1,000-yard stare that marked men who had looked too long into the abyss. The rope itself had become legendary among 77th Infantry Division veterans, its story growing with each retelling until it assumed almost mystical properties. But Doss remembered the hemp fibers parting one by one under each load, the growing certainty that the next evacuation might be the one that sent both rescuer and wounded plummeting to death on the coral below. Faith had carried him through the night, but it was faith mixed with a terror so pure it seemed to burn away everything except the essential human obligation to preserve life. Jenkins, now a grandfather in Michigan, kept a photograph from their Pacific service on his workshop wall. It showed the company after their withdrawal from Hacksaw Ridge, with Doss sitting slightly apart from the others, cleaning his medical equipment with the methodical precision that had marked all his actions. What the photograph couldn't capture was the way the medic's hands had shaken for days afterward, or the nightmares that would wake him decades later with the sound of wounded men calling his name across a ridge that existed now only in memory. The most difficult part, Doss reflected, had not been the physical danger or even the accumulated exhaustion of moving wounded men across impossible ground. It had been the knowledge that each successful rescue raised the expectations for the next, that each man saved meant another family that would receive their son alive rather than in a coffin. The weight of that responsibility had nearly broken him several times during the night, forcing him to stop and pray for strength to continue when every rational instinct screamed for him to seek safety with the others. Captain Moeller's after-action report, filed 2 days after the ridge was finally secured, compressed the night's events into 3 paragraphs of military prose that mentioned individual heroism without capturing its cost. The report noted efficient medical evacuation under fire and commended the unit's discipline during withdrawal, but it couldn't convey the image that would stay with Moeller for the rest of his military career. One unarmed soldier moving through darkness toward wounded men who had been written off as casualties of war. The secret that Doss never shared publicly was how close he had come to stopping, how many times during that night he had looked at the fraying rope and the impossible distance to the next wounded man and felt his faith waver. In those moments, only the sound of someone calling medic had pulled him forward, adding another name to his mental list of men who trusted him to choose their lives over his own safety. The hemp rope, cut into small pieces after the war and distributed among the survivors as souvenirs, carried more weight than its physical substance could account for. Each strand represented a choice made in darkness, a moment when faith overcame fear, a demonstration that sometimes the most effective weapon is the refusal to carry one at all. Years later, when well-meaning interviewers asked about his heroism on Hacksaw Ridge, Doss would deflect their questions with gentle humor and scripture references. But in the privacy of his own memory, he carried a different truth, that legendary courage often looks like ordinary terror transformed by extraordinary stubbornness, and that the line between heroism and suicide is sometimes visible only to God. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place on a crisp October morning in 1945, President Truman himself placing the ribbon around Doss's neck in the White House Rose Garden. The citation spoke of gallant heroism and conspicuous bravery, reducing the terror and complexity of Hacksaw Ridge to formal language that could be read aloud and recorded for history. But as Doss stood at attention, his mind drifted to a hemp rope and the weight of 23 men, lowered one by one down a cliff face in darkness. The other survivors of the 77th Infantry Division attended when they could, men who had returned to farms in Iowa and factories in Pennsylvania, carrying their own versions of that night. Jenkins brought his wife and new baby, introducing them to the medic who had redefined his understanding of courage under fire. The infant girl, born 8 months after Hacksaw Ridge, represented the continuation of life that made their sacrifices meaningful. New generations who would inherit a world slightly better because some men had chosen to preserve life rather than take it. Dr. Patterson kept detailed medical records from his Pacific service, documents that told a different story than the official histories. 23 severely wounded soldiers had arrived at his aid station during a period when no organized evacuation was supposed to be possible. Each case file represented hours of surgical work made necessary by injuries sustained in combat, but made survivable by one man's refusal to abandon the wounded to the darkness. The rope itself had been destroyed in the artillery barrage that finally cleared Hacksaw Ridge of Japanese resistance. its hemp fibers scattered by high explosive and consumed by phosphorus shells that turned the plateau into a moonscape of twisted metal and shattered coral. Yet its influence continued through the men it had saved, their children and grandchildren, the expanding circles of life made possible by a few hours of impossible courage in the spring of 1945. Doss returned to Virginia after the war, working as a carpenter and raising a family that never fully understood why their father would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, listening for voices calling his name across decades and continents. The nightmares faded gradually, but never completely disappeared, carried forward into civilian life like shrapnel too close to vital organs to be safely removed. The sound of hemp rope under stress, the smell of wet canvas and iodine, the particular quality of light that filtered through smoke and falling rain, all remained permanently etched into memory. Years later, when the story of Hacksaw Ridge was adapted for film and television, Doss would watch with mixed emotions as actors portrayed events he remembered primarily as fear, exhaustion, and desperate improvisation. The dramatic requirements of storytelling transformed his terror into heroism, his prayers into dialogue, his stubborn refusal to abandon the wounded into something approaching divine intervention. He understood the necessity of such transformation while privately maintaining the truth that legends weigh less than memories. The final twist came decades after the war, when medical researchers studying combat stress discovered that many Hacksaw Ridge survivors had experienced unusually low rates of post-traumatic symptoms. The theory, supported by extensive interviews and psychological testing, suggested that witnessing extraordinary acts of selflessness could provide a form of psychological protection against the worst effects of combat trauma. Jenkins, now in his 70s, attributed his relatively peaceful post-war life to the memory of watching one unarmed man accomplish what their combined firepower couldn't achieve. The second revelation emerged from Japanese sources discovered during the 1990s, documents that described the bewilderment of enemy commanders as they watched a single American soldier moving across supposedly impassable ground. Japanese machine gunners had reported multiple opportunities to eliminate the medic, but found their weapons jamming at crucial moments, their ammunition running low just as clear shots presented themselves. Whether attributed to mechanical failure, divine intervention, or simple combat luck, the pattern had been consistent enough to generate official reports and tactical discussions. Today, visitors to Okinawa can stand where Hacksaw Ridge once dominated the landscape. Now peaceful hills covered with memorial parks and monuments to both sides' sacrifice. A simple plaque marks the approximate location where Doss's rope connected the plateau to the world below. Its modest inscription, unable to convey the weight of 23 lives carried down through darkness. The hemp itself is long gone, but its influence continues through the descendants of men who lived because one soldier refused to carry a weapon into the most violent place imaginable. In his final interview, conducted at age 87, while sitting in the Virginia home where he had lived since the war, Doss was asked to summarize the meaning of his actions on Hacksaw Ridge. His response, barely audible above the rain that still reminded him of Pacific Islands and distant gunfire, captured the essential truth that official histories and Hollywood adaptations could never quite convey. "I just couldn't leave them up there alone. Legend says I saved them, but the truth is, they saved me, gave me a reason to keep moving when everything else told me to stop." Bree, if this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.